As Neil said, I work at the University of Bristol. I'm not a clinician, I'm a biochemist who turned into a microbiologist. I've worked on antimicrobial resistance for nearly 20 years, since before anybody else thought it was a problem. And I'm gratified to see so many people turning up today. I think it's indicative that generally awareness around AMR is increasing. And I did a talk in a pub on Monday night. There was about 100 people in a pub to listen to me speak about antimicrobial resistance. Feels a bit like that here, actually, with the bar. But, I gave about half an hour talk. I thought they'd all just run to the bar, but we had a half an hour of questions afterwards from the general public. And I think the public are aware of the issue. They're becoming increasingly engaged and educated about the issue, and I think it's therefore important that we all sort of keep up with that and keep up the pressure to try and deal with some of the problems that we know about and to actually do some research. And so I want to talk about some of the background and some of the research that we're doing today around selection and transmission of antimicrobial resistance in animals and how that then might affect humans. Acronyms, I'll probably use AMR. I might talk about antibiotics or antimicrobials. What I really mean, antibacterial drugs and antibacterial drug resistance. Obviously, lots of other things are important, but I'm specifically talking about antibacterials. Okay, and the primary driver for the project that I'm going to talk about today is the issue around the developed world and the fact that antimicrobial resistance is predominantly an issue around healthcare-associated infections. Now, actually, the problem of AMR around the world is much, 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 much bigger than that, and we shouldn't forget that in many parts of the world, access to effective antimicrobials is a real problem, and that there are huge problems around TB and gonorrhea and other issues of organisms that have developed resistance. But really, I want to talk about opportunistic infections, and I'm sure that many of you will be thinking about opportunistic infections on a day-to-day basis in your professions. These sorts of numbers you all know better than I probably, but the point I want to pick up on is that a significant proportion, if not a majority of these infections are caused by E. coli, which is a bacterium that's found in human and animal feces, okay? So we all carry it around with us, and so do pretty much all animals as well. So the link, if you like, that I'm going to draw between humans and animals is around predominantly E. coli, because they have it, we have it, and it's a big problem in terms of opportunistic infections. Because of opportunistic infections and other infections which are transmissible, we need antibiotics, of course. I was born in 1973, so something happened about the time that I was born. Basically, they stopped really developing new antimicrobials. It's not my fault. Basically, what happened was all of these antimicrobial classes, most of which we still use today, were literally dug out of the ground. They're natural resources, and they were relatively easy to find. It took a bit of an effort, but relatively easy and relatively cheap to find. Once they found all these, they kind of thought, oh, well, let's spend our money on something else. We've got plenty. And obviously, after that point, resistance has started to become more of an issue, and we've lost, to a certain extent, some of the skills that were necessary to discover these antimicrobials. But also, because we'd already discovered all the easy ones to find, it's more difficult to find new ones. That's for someone else to talk about. I just wanted really for you to get into your mind the idea is that these are natural products. You can find these antimicrobials in your back garden at home. Okay, they're all around us. And, of course, we're all familiar with Fleming, who supposedly accidentally discovered penicillin because a mold blew in through an open window. I've just been reading a book by Richard Lax called The Mold in Dr. Florey's Coat, and actually it sort of debunks this. Apparently this was kind of a made-up story. It never really happened. He was basically testing pretty much anything he could get his hands on, chucking it on plates to see if he could find something that would kill bacteria. Because a lot of people don't realize that he actually discovered lysozyme, which is a substance we produce as a natural defense against bacteria. Anyway, he discovered it. It's around us all over. And Yet, it's therefore not surprising to me, but it is surprising to a lot of people, that resistance developed so rapidly. So, for example, we already knew about penicillin resistance before penicillin was clinically used. And penicillin resistance in some organisms emerged incredibly quickly, like Staph aureus, skin bacterium that you will encounter. And the reason why Staph aureus is resistant to penicillin is because it produces an enzyme, like a Pac-Man that chews up penicillin, a penicillinase enzyme. It takes about 10 million years to evolve one of these enzymes. So clearly that hasn't happened since we started using penicillin in the 1940s as a clinical therapy. The reason why it was waiting and ready for us is that penicillin's a natural product. It's been in the environment for millions and millions and millions of years. And so bacteria in the environment have had plenty of time to evolve these mechanisms of resistance. And then, of course, bacteria are very good at sharing their genetic information, passing on these resistance mechanisms to other bacteria. So if penicillin's found in your back garden, penicillin-resistant bacteria will also be found in your back garden. If you go out gardening, you're going to get those bacteria on your skin, potentially from the soil, and they're potentially going to share their resistance with your skin bacteria. Now you've got penicillin-resistant skin bacteria. Okay? So this is one of the reasons why antibiotic resistance emerged so quickly and still emerges so quickly, because it's present in the environment. Of course, the fact that we use penicillin will stimulate this process. And the same with all antimicrobials. You could draw this graph for pretty much any antibiotic that we use. This is penicillin resistance. It just shows that in countries that give out penicillin kind of a little bit like sweets, where they use a lot, they get a lot of resistance. The more you use it, the faster you lose it, as they say. Countries like our Scandinavian colleagues, where you have to be pretty much dead before they'll give you an antibiotic, they don't use a lot, and therefore they don't get a lot of resistance. It's not rocket science, really. But by use an antibiotic, what do we mean? And I guess that's a bulk of what I'm going to say today. It's not just what you might use as healthcare professionals. It might be what's used around and about us in the environment. It might not just be antibiotics that selects for this as well. Now, Fleming discovered penicillin, supposedly accidentally. He didn't really get involved in developing it into a drug, but he still got the Nobel Prize anyway. And everybody quotes this. Round about November, Antibiotic Awareness Week, I see this on Twitter all the time, you know. Fleming, he was so prescient, he knew so much about resistance. If we misuse antibiotics, then we're going to cause problems of resistance. And they trot out this phrase, if the man, it's always a man, who's ignorant anyway, underdoses himself, then effectively that might cause resistance and he might pass it. I think the quote goes on to say he's going to pass it on to his wife and she's going to die. It's usually the way, isn't it? Now, of course, Fleming said this without really knowing how antibiotic resistance evolves. In fact, Fleming said this without really knowing what antibiotic resistance means. In fact, clinicians today still argue about what antibiotic resistance really means in terms of clinical outcome. And so he was thinking about resistance in a very different way from the way certainly I think about resistance now, and I'll explain that in a minute. But this kind of idea that if we underdose patients, if they're not quite getting enough antibiotic, that drives resistance, actually I think has led to some overuse of antimicrobials. And this is one example in the veterinary profession. So my wife's a small animal vet. She runs her own practice. She gets every week the vet record. It's like the kind of BMJ of the vet world. And nobody reads it in our house apart from me, okay? And you turn over and you get a page which says, oh, we should prudently use antimicrobials. Vets are very important. And you turn the next page and there's a big advert for a new antimicrobial. And you think, okay, what's going on? And this is an example of the sort of mindset that vets are in. They're really worried about this not giving enough antibiotic. And they're particularly interested in this in the context of cats and maybe dogs that are difficult to give tablets to. If you ever try to give a tablet to a cat, you know that you might lose your fingers. And so they're worried about the idea that they're going to send the owner home with the tablets. The owner's going to give one, get bitten, and never give any more. And that's terrible. Well, that's the worst thing you can do because you're underdosing the animal. You're not completing the course. So the drug companies picked up on this anxiety and said, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could have a long-acting antimicrobial injection? So they brought out this particular product, which is cefavecin. It's basically a third-generation cephalosporin. This is a big boy antibiotic. But you inject it into your cat, and now you can do it to dogs as well. And it lasts in serum for about 14 days. You don't have to worry about underdosing. But actually, most of the infection that this gets given for are things like cat bite abscesses, which probably don't need an antibiotic at all, let's face it. But if they do, it might be a couple of days, and that'll be it. But you're committing, as a clinician, because of this anxiety of underdosing, to actually dosing the animal for 14 days with a third-generation cephalosporin, okay, which is critically important antimicrobial for human medicine. That's rain, isn't it? Yeah. They provide boats for us to get out afterwards. So this is the sort of thing that can be worked towards, and vets are using these drugs for convenience, and it's called Convenia. That's the trade name of this thing, okay? Now, the reason why I think Fleming was wrong, and the reason why people who are anxious about underdosing are sometimes wrong in terms of selection of antibiotic resistance, is because there's this perception that superbugs, that antibiotic resistance is developed a bit like a giraffe developing a long neck. So you imagine, you think about the principle. Gradually, over time, the leaves just get a little bit higher on the tree, and the neck just gets a little bit longer, and it gives a survival advantage. And you could see how then, if you just slightly underdose, so the dose is just within reach, the bacterium can evolve to be resistant to that. And then you can go up, and gradually, eventually, you become resistant. But superbugs are not giraffes. They don't tend to evolve like this. Some do, and TB does, Streptococcus pneumoniae does, gonorrhea does. But most bacteria don't evolve resistance in this sequential, mutation-driven way. They evolve resistance in a single hit because they share genetic information from environmental bacteria and from each other. So it's effectively like a horse sticking on a giraffe costume. Just all of a sudden, bang, now they're resistant. And now if you think about this concept that it's not sequential, it's not about necessarily not quite giving enough, it's probably about giving antibiotic for too long, because the longer you're giving the antibiotic, the more chance you have of picking up one of these resistant organisms. And so therefore, when you're dosing your cat, you're effectively creating a cat with a vacuum cleaner, and I like showing this picture because it's a cat with a vacuum cleaner, and wouldn't that be good if your cat could clean up after itself? But anyway, basically what you're doing, I believe, is because you're killing the normal bacterial flora with the antibiotic for 14 days before things start to calm down, at least, now your cat is potentially going and interacting with the environment and picking up antimicrobial resistant organisms from the environment, which could replace its normal flora. So this is not an issue of therapeutic failure. The cat bite abscess is going to get better. Probably would have done anyway without the antibiotic. But this is more about the issue of replacing normal bacteria in the gut of the cat. And we work with cows, and they're given antibiotics as well. And so now you could have I couldn't find an actual photograph of a cow with a vacuum cleaner. That's as good as I could do. But humans are the same, I would argue. You know, you've got this issue of interaction with the environment, but animals perhaps interact with the environment more, and so there's more propensity for them to pick up resistant organisms. But we do know that when you dose patients with antibiotics, they are therefore more likely to have resistant organisms in their normal flora. So this is work done by Ashley Bryce, who's one of my postdocs on the projects I'm going to talk about. This is work with Alistair Hay, who's a professor of primary care in Bristol. It's a meta-analysis published in that this is just one antibiotic. This is urinary tract infection. If you give an antibiotic, then within a fortnight, you're 6 times more likely to be colonized with an antibiotic-resistant organism. This is trimethoprim. You can do a similar analysis for any. It takes almost a year before it goes back to 1, which is basically no difference from control. So it takes a while for that effect, and this is in pediatrics. Okay, it may be different in adults, but in pediatrics it certainly is quite pronounced. And of course we know that interaction with the environment for humans, just like animals, is potentially going to affect us. So this study came out last year which shows how if people travel to areas of the world where there's high levels of antibiotic-resistant E. coli just in the environment, they are quite likely to pick those up, 34% of them. And what's really interesting is that if those people happened to get ill or for some reason were given an antibiotic whilst they were on holiday, they were much more likely to pick up. So therefore, this is this vacuum cleaner effect, I believe, that's being given the antibiotics. They then came home, and they remained colonized for quite a long time, potentially up to 12 months. They stopped swabbing them after that time, and they were still colonized. And what's more, they passed it on to their other household members. And now the numbers start getting smaller because, remember, you've got to get someone